Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Well, I'm glad you got out of the pool for a minute so we could record.
Yeah, is this thing on?
It looks like you're beside a pool somewhere.
I know.
But that's not the case, is
it? No, it's not. So, I think we mentioned on the last episode that I was doing a bit of traveling, and I'm up seeing the in-laws, letting the kids see the in-laws, and I've been out at their cabin, and it's out in the middle of nowhere, and it's hard to find an internet connection, and basically, I'm finding it where I can. Sometimes it's next to a pool, I guess.
Yeah, I mean there must be something wrong with those wires, because by the time your image is getting here, it doesn't look quite like a Marcus, but I guess they're coming from a long ways away. But how's the fishing been?
Oh man, it's been slow. And I think that is mainly because of me. So I've been trying to fly fish, and I've caught quite a few trout, but several of the streams of water is a little bit warm, and I'm not very good at it. So
well, I'm hoping that I can catch some fish in some saltier water next week. I'm headed down. Yeah, I'm headed down to the Gulf this weekend. We're headed down, and we're staying for part of next week.
Oh, cool.
And, so hopefully we'll catch some different trout than what you're after this week.
Yeah.
But
it's another
we'll see.
Good eating fish.
Yeah. So with you being on the road, me getting ready to go on the road, and summer and all that entails and whatnot, we haven't had as much time to do some of the deep dives into lit reviews on topics and stuff like that we regularly do on the podcast. And you and I were kind of talking earlier about what we're going to discuss today, and it's pretty apparent from the survey responses that we've had so far that folks never really get enough of us talking about habitat management and what they could potentially do to their land. And so I figured we would just kind of bounce some ideas and some thoughts back and forth on that today.
No, I think that's a good idea, and particularly, our recent episode we got into monitoring poults. It's obviously really important this time of year, and that's also something that I still get probably the majority of the questions about. So I think it would be a good idea to talk about habitat management from that point of view, at least part of the time as well.
Absolutely. So starting out with that, we're kind of, pretty much everywhere except maybe, if you get into the extreme northern part of the country or, southern Canada, most poults are getting pretty big by now, right? So that specialized, vegetation that we talk about them needing a lot on this show is not as important to them right now. I'm not saying it's unimportant. It's not as important, but it will be important again next year. And so I feel like if we're going to talk about habitat for turkeys, we always have to start with brooding habitat.
Yeah.
And as far as that goes, the lowest hanging fruit that I see on the vast majority of properties is that the open areas, like their food plots and their roadsides and power line right-of-ways, gas line right-of-ways, odd areas, as Craig calls them, fruit tree orchards, whatever, any area that has enough sunlight that it could probably grow grass, is that it's
It
growing
is grass.
exotic grass. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so this is something that people that even that, if they lease land, they can get out there with an herbicide and, you know, change that plant community that is pre-existing. They don't have to cut any trees or anything like that into something that's more usable by turkeys.
Yeah. I think that you're exactly right. That is a low hanging fruit. It's also, if you remember our episode where we were talking about what if I don't own land,
Yeah.
it's also area that you could target on those
That was a long
places
time
often.
ago. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
That one was
been a
I'm
while.
sure I'm sure we have a few folks that weren't listening back then. They're listening now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, our audience has definitely grown. I don't know
Yeah.
if our new audience has, gone back through all the episodes or not, but we did have
Mhm.
an episode, if you're in that boat, that we kind of tried to unpack the issue of I don't own land, I lease it, so I'm limited.
Mhm.
What are things I can do to improve
Yeah.
habitat? But
Right.
I think for brooding cover, that might be one of the opportunities that you have more opportunity in that situation to affect.
Mhm.
So one thing, this is going to be kind of a sidebar, but it's sort of similar. It was just posed to me yesterday by a local up in northern Michigan, and he asked me, I forgot how he phrased it, but he was asking me what was limiting turkey populations essentially, and
Mhm.
why we see differences in populations in different places. And one of the things he asked me about were poults. And I think we've talked to a few people about this, and data suggests that the poult per hen ratios are usually much higher in the northern.
Yeah. I think that tends to be true.
So then I've been contemplating that, and I'm just curious, what do you have any reaction to why they might be quite a bit higher in the northern part of the range, so the southern part?
I don't know, Marcus. There's something that comes to
Because
mind, but I feel like
I've been going all around, and there's plenty of predators around,
yeah.
and I also don't see a lot of what I would consider high quality brooding cover around where I'm
Yeah.
at. But then I'm like, well, what? Why would their poult per hen ratio be higher?
I had a facetious answer.
Okay, what's that?
They don't bait as much up there.
Oh, that is not the case in the
That is
state
not
I'm
the
in.
I know that is not the case for the state that you're in, absolutely. Um, that was my facetious answer. My more serious answer, now that I've had a little bit of time to think about it, is I wonder if it doesn't have something to do with the fact that their growing season is so much shorter, and so succession takes longer to occur. Thus, if you have an area that is in the early successional cover that oftentimes supports brooding, is necessary to support brooding, that it'll be a more long lasting feature on the landscape than it would be, say, in Alabama or a Florida, where we've got, a 10-month growing season or a 9-month growing season or even a 12-month, if you
Yeah,
get down into peninsular Florida.
yeah, I can see that, and I've been noticing places that have been cut.
Hmm.
That it's impressive how slow succession is occurring compared to what I'm used to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I could see that happening, but I also contemplated another answer, and I know we're on a sidebar, but it is related here. It's still habitat related. But I started thinking, we focus a lot on pulse and when we're thinking about exposure with cold temperatures, and maybe less, or I would say most people don't
Hmm.
immediately go into extreme heat temperature
Yeah.
exposure.
Yeah.
And then I started wondering, wonder if that is a big difference, because here it's not getting, really hot
Hmm.
on any day, basically
Yeah.
during brooding.
Right.
Not compared to, what the average temperature is basically daily, and particularly at night, the temperatures are quite a bit cooler here than what I'm accustomed to. So
Hmm.
I started wondering, I wonder if we're kind of on that other side of the thermoneutral zone,
Yeah.
where, yeah, if you had a cold snap, that could be a real problem. But it's usually not getting too hot. Maybe it's often getting too hot for us down south, making
Maybe it's so.
that vegetation structure way more important.
Yeah, maybe so, but I think the other important thing to keep in mind too is a lot of times we fall into this fallacy of thinking that it has to be one thing, when the reality
Yeah,
is that it's probably multiple contributing factors. So, you start thinking about everything that's different between here and there, and you've got different land uses, different, successional trajectories, like we talked about, different species composition, different invasives, both plant and animal. Like think about feral pigs in the
yeah,
South compared to the Northeast. I mean, just so many things that you can stack up and add um, that would make it reasonable for there to be a difference between the North and the South.
right. Yeah, that's a good point. Anyway, well, how do you what I guess if you're thinking about the typical place, that you're going to try to improve brooding cover.
Hmm.
You talked about the areas that are often, we'll say, neglected
Yeah.
that could be improved. So, how are you going through your thought process when you're trying to evaluate where am I going to focus my efforts?
Yeah. So if I'm on a property where turkeys are a management priority, I'm gonna focus that on all of the open areas on the property. I think,
Yeah.
and one area that I think that a lot of hunters overlook how beneficial that they could be to the turkeys on their property or their food plots. And
Hmm.
specifically, what I mean is on the average hunting club, what do people do with their food plots? They plant them in fall, they hunt them through the end of deer season, and then they, especially if they're not turkey hunters, they don't look at them again until they come back and plant them in fall, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they come out a couple days during summer and mess around with tree stands and stuff like that, but other than that, they're probably not doing much with the food plot. So one of the
Yeah. Other
things,
than maybe driving past them,
right?
just when they're on the property or something, they're not
Yeah,
necessarily paying attention to what they look like.
yeah. So if you're not planning a warm season food plot, there is no reason. If you're not planning a warm season crop, you're only planting cool season annual plants in your food plots. There is no reason that you should not be managing for brooding cover during the summertime. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, I
And
think
the yeah, and
that's
so
a
the biggest
obvious way that you can integrate your deer and turkey management.
right, and the biggest problem that you're probably going to initially face when trying to manage food plots for turkey brooding cover is ryegrass. And we've talked about
Mm.
ryegrass quite a bit
At
on here
least in the deep
before.
south. Yeah,
Yeah, in the deep south. But then like as you go further north, you're probably going to have, problems with like fescue and orchard grass and smooth brome. And those are going to be a challenge.
yep,
Luckily, if you get the timing of application right, you can just use like a generic glyphosate based herbicide and deal with a lot of those cool season grasses pretty easily. And generally speaking, if you're spraying cool season grasses, the best time to do it is when they start, actively growing. They're young and have vigorous growth in the fall. And then
yeah,
if you have warm season exotic grasses, the ideal time is going to be when they're young and vigorously growing in the spring. That's when the best time to
right.
apply is.
Well, and I think it may be a good time to talk about when you're using herbicides to control something like that. I think those plants are particularly problematic for you
Hmm.
to reach your objectives. If
Yeah.
it is, if your objectives are relating to brooding cover, those are particularly problematic. And that,
Hmm.
if you don't take some effort to control them, it's going to be very difficult for you to get to your objective.
Yeah.
So that's not to say we're necessarily trying to broadcast herbicide all the time. I know there have been several people that have contacted me concerned about that,
Yeah.
but it may be necessary one time or some species multiple times to get it under control. And then the idea is you're trying to get to a place where you don't need herbicide all the time,
Yeah. I
at
don't
least
want to, I
broadcasting.
don't, yeah. I mean, I don't. I don't get any enjoyment out of having to put herbicide out, and it's an
Yeah, I don't either.
expense. It's an expense for me, right? But
Yeah,
it's a tool that I'm not afraid to use either.
that's
That's the way
right.
I look at
And
it.
I've run into this so many times where people talk about, wanting to improve brooding cover, and then they just stop mowing their
Yeah,
grass patch,
yeah.
and it kind of starts getting rough, and it's probably better than than it just being a solid mat of grass.
Mhm.
But the grass is still a problem if it's a
Yeah,
thatch underneath, your forward cover or whatever's regenerating in there.
yeah. Well,
It's
and that's
still a
something
problem. So
that is a really good, I think, an important point. And I have had people, reach out to me and say, in reference to us talking about managing brooding cover with herbicides, I've had people reach out and say, well, haven't there been some papers published that show a negative effect of glyphosate on pollinator communities? Which, of course,
mm,
pollinator communities would make up a portion of the wild turkey's prey base. I'm not familiar with that literature. Maybe there are papers out there that have shown that, but the
there
way that
certainly are with some chemicals.
yeah,
There's certainly
but
data
then
like that.
the way that I responded to that message was that very well may be the case, but I think what's more important is for us to look at the net effect, right?
Yeah,
And I have seen many fescue fields, Bahia grass fields, and Bermuda grass fields that were converted to a native grass forb mixture using herbicide. And there is absolutely no question that the pollinators, the insects, and the overall native biodiversity benefited from that application.
yeah.
I
You
mean,
have a
you're
higher
talking
plant
about
diversity and higher insect diversity that's obvious when you're
no
standing.
question. No question. I mean, just think about the amount of insects that you see on a Bermuda grass hayfield versus a field that's full of wildflowers,
Yeah,
you know? And those are the main
yeah.
species that we face. If you're a turkey manager and you manage turkey habitat, you have no excuse not to be able to identify, fescue, Bahia grass if you're in the southeast, Bermuda grass if you're in the southeast.
Hmm.
Um, what am I missing, Marcus? Those are the ryegrass, obviously, we've
Yeah,
talked a lot about.
yeah. The Bermuda, Bahia, ryegrass are the ones that I am encountering by far the
Yeah.
most.
Fescue as you get more into the mid south and then further north.
And I see orchard grass a fair amount in
Mhm.
that mid south region as well.
Yeah. And so those are the main ones that you need to be able to identify and that we're targeting. Um, Plateau can be a really good herbicide to use in battling some of those exotic pasture grasses. Plateau does have some residual soil activity, so it'll help you out in that regard.
Yeah.
Glyphosate tends to be my go-to chemical for most of our perennial cool season grasses. Um, Escort is what I typically use for Bahia grass, and then Arsenal is what I typically use for Bermuda grass.
Hmm.
But just beware of that if you're spraying under non pines. If you could potentially damage them with the Arsenal and
Yeah.
some of the others too.
Well, and even so, we've talked to a few people. It seems to be a really contentious issue with in the community right now, with this regenerative approach, and a lot of people. Well, I guess part of that approach includes excluding chemicals like herbicides. So
Yeah,
I think that's one thing that we need to work on and see what the trade-offs are, right?
yeah,
Because I think most people that are engaged in that have a different set of objectives.
yeah. They are.
They may
They do.
want to get turkey brooding cover out of it, or whatever else out
Right.
of it, but it doesn't seem to be the overarching objective of someone transitioning specifically to that practice.
Yeah, I think you have people that are transitioning to it just to reduce their input cost, and then
Yeah,
you have other people that are doing it, more so for the environmental objectives.
Yeah,
or
and
the
that's fine.
the health objectives.
Yeah, and I'm not casting shade on anybody, but if your
Sure.
objective is poult rearing cover and you have a problematic plant in that mix, or, in the plant community dominating, like Bermuda,
Yeah.
it may require some action to take care of it. And
Yeah.
maybe it takes some action up front and then you transition away from it over time because you get rid of the problem. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on this still,
Yeah.
and trying to figure out how to integrate turkey management into that approach. But
Yeah.
I do feel like since we've talked about it recently and we've gotten a number of comments from people about that topic, people would probably want us to cover it here,
Yeah.
especially when we're talking about using herbicides.
Yeah, and the way that I'm looking at it right now, as far as, the regen ag, I look at it as I'm glad people are doing it. I'm glad people are discovering these new tools and techniques because those are more tools and techniques that I have in my toolbox that I can choose from to try to accomplish my objectives.
Yeah,
I'm not the type of person that I'm going to go out and do regenerative ag just for regenerative ag's sake. But if
yeah,
regenerative ag can better help me create turkey habitat, or at least it can create just as good of turkey habitat at a lower cost than conventional agriculture, 100%.
oh yeah.
Why would I not use the regenerative practice?
Well, and you were talking about a few minutes ago trying to kind of falling in this trap of trying to point to one thing that it is or isn't. Well, we do the
Yeah.
same thing with you don't necessarily have to go all in, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you pick a few
Well,
places that you do one thing. Maybe you got a few regen plots and you got a few other ones that you're going to be
yeah.
intensively and deliberately trying to produce pulp cover, regardless of how you have to go about that.
Yeah, and looking back at some of the comments that people made on those regen ag episodes, it seemed like that was one of their major frustrations is that we were framing it as a black and white thing, like you either did
Yeah,
regen or you didn't.
yeah,
That was never our intent. In fact, our intent was to start by explaining what it was, kind of from like a purist perspective, and
yeah. Like
then,
what is
yeah,
the entire practice at it?
right,
If you implemented every part of the strategy.
yeah. But we fully recognize and think, people should be, picking and choosing those practices to help meet their objectives. We were never
Yeah,
suggesting that it was an all or nothing proposition. I think more so what we were trying to do is establish what it is before we started talking about what we might do or not do, with it
hmm,
when it came to managing turkeys.
yeah. Well, I have gotten feedback from a few people that are using some version of that practice that have been concerned about the structure during brooding.
Yeah,
That, and I'm very much still in the learning phase, but it's
right.
something that there are a lot of people interested in it, and you know how that goes when
Yeah,
people get really interested in some sort of habitat management
yeah,
strategy. You and I both do the same thing. We start trying to learn as much as we can about it, and
yeah.
then start working on it in some cases.
And so what we may eventually find is that you can use regenerative ag practices and still have quality brooding cover, but you have to change something about the the blend that you plant in spring. Maybe you reduce
Yeah,
like the seed population or something like that to leave more bare ground between
right. Or
plants.
you change this, you tweak this suite of species, or maybe the timing of some of
Yeah,
the key things that you're doing in the and we've talked about that on the other episodes, but I felt like when we're talking about field management, that's going to be on the tip of a lot of people's mind because we just went through that series recently,
yeah,
and there are, that is gaining steam in terms of interest for
right.
people.
Yeah. So back to after our little regen ag sidebar, back to talking about the food plots or the roadsides or whatever. When you start out managing those, if you have widespread problems with some of those species that we mentioned, maybe it'll require a broadcast application, but longer term, the hope would be that you can maintain those areas just by spot spraying, a broad spectrum like glyphosate herbicide to just take out, it's like, oh, I had another, fescue patch pop up over here. I'm just going to go spray that one patch and I'm done. So
Hmm.
the hope would be that over time, as you do this repeatedly, that you're intentionally selecting for a species composition of desirable plants so that there's less and less work to do.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that that's the ultimate goal is to get it into a maintenance stage where it requires the minimum amount of time and resources to accomplish your objective structurally and
Hmm.
compositionally.
Yeah.
I had a quick question for you. Uh, it just popped into my head. So for those out there, just to kind of give you some context on why I'm asking this, Will was doing some digging before the show and mentioned to me that he had found an old forum or something that Lovett
Yeah.
was on and answering questions, which is really
Yeah.
cool. And
Yeah.
we're going to have to explore that a lot. In fact,
Yeah.
we were thinking about covering some of the Q&A stuff that he did, and maybe if there's new data that have
Yeah.
emerged that could change how he answered things back in those days. If you'd like us
Right.
to do that, reach out to us, let us know that,
Yeah.
because I think that might be a fun episode, and I think some of our audience might appreciate something like that.
Well, I had
But
the idea. I was like, I'm going to put the questions to you, and we'll see how Marcus answers, and see if he was right by comparing to Lovett. But I don't think Marcus was
well,
crazy about that idea.
yeah. Well, I obviously have a lot of humility because how many times have you asked me things and I just completely don't know or get it wrong?
Yeah.
But I just let that go on the air.
Yeah.
I don't know everything there is to know, but I'm trying my best to become as knowledgeable about every aspect of this as I can,
There you go.
and
That's all
that's
you
a
can do.
process. But the reason I brought it up, I was curious to you. Did you see him talking about Polts or poultry and cover or anything in any of those Q&A?
Mm-mm. No, I didn't notice any of that.
Because I know he did a lot of that imprinting work, and I
Yeah.
I started thinking about that because they they didn't have the wide range of tools in terms of chemicals at their
Yeah.
disposal that we do. So I'm really curious
That's a really good point.
what their suggestions were to people. I know we could glean that from some of the early literature, and I have read through some of that, but I was just curious if you had seen it
You know,
since
I
you were just
didn't.
on that forum.
I didn't, but what's really interesting about that is that I didn't see much information at all about habitat management coming from him. And I don't know if that was just because that's not what people were asking about, because I don't remember seeing a lot of questions in particular about it either.
Yeah,
But yeah, I didn't see any of his recommendations. And you bring up a good point, like they didn't have as many of the herbicide solutions that we have now, but they also didn't have as many of the invasives as we have now.
that's right. I was about to say that same thing.
Yeah.
They also probably weren't dealing with the same suite of
Mm-mm.
particularly sod forming grasses that we are now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that'd be interesting to look into. But
Right.
if folks out there are interested in hearing us talk about, finding resources like that, I started wondering if there were actually multiple forums that we could find on multiple
Yeah.
historical figures like that,
Yeah.
where they were doing sort of a Q&A type thing.
That'd be interesting to look into for sure. Um, so I went first with talking about, killing the grass, let's say.
Kill the
And
grass,
and
folks.
and stole that thunder from you. So let's just continue with the theme, and so what's going to be the next thing that you're going to look at on this hypothetical property?
In terms of like what I'm going to target.
Yeah.
Well, I think one thing we've brought it up, and some of our guests have brought it up multiple times. Brooding cover can be accomplished in fields, but it also exists elsewhere, right? Or can exist elsewhere. And I think
100%.
looking at your forest management practices and in particular making sure that you have some areas that have high sunlight penetration to the forest floor and coupled with fire is another good way that you can improve brooding cover. And I think another advantage of that, depending on what stage it's in the fire return interval, you can simultaneously be providing brooding and nesting cover in close
Mm-hmm.
proximity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that to me is another key thing. It's not available to everybody because you may have you may not own the land or some other suite of constraints that is keeping you from just doing it optimally in terms of the distribution across the property.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another key area to look. I think in particular, I'm looking for areas that have, at least 30% penetration of sunlight. Uh, that could be much higher than that. And I'm thinking about a fire return interval, that is essentially perpetually keeping it dominated by herbaceous species
Mm-hmm.
and, preventing succession of
Yeah, it's just
hardwoods
alternating
encroaching.
back and forth between brooding, nesting, brooding, nesting. It never gets
Yeah,
past that.
right. And they typically, on most sites, the year of fire and sometimes the year after fire, at least in the south, are pretty good brooding
Mm-hmm.
structurally.
Yeah.
And then a little bit longer in the interval, like the second year and third year after fire, might be really good for nesting. That might extend a little bit longer in some places,
Mm-hmm.
and it may be relatively short in
Right.
some places as well in
Yeah.
terms of that time interval. With really long growing seasons and high rainfall in productive soil, like you see in some places in the deep south, the 2 year return interval is almost necessary to avoid transitioning, you know,
Yeah.
into the mid story with your hardwood
Yeah,
encroachment.
I almost never recommend that a landowner intentionally go 3 years or more between burns in the southeast when turkeys are a priority.
Yeah,
Most of the time, it's going to be max 2 years. As fast
yeah,
as things grow down here. Um,
yeah.
but I
But
think that
sometimes in poor soil productivity in
yes,
particular, a little bit longer is fine.
yeah, and then also, if they have deer objectives too, there's some potential reasons that you
Yeah,
would let it go a little bit longer. That's an important point
yeah,
to make. But I'm glad that you brought up the topic of brooding cover in the woods too. I think that's
yeah.
super important. Um, and the reason that I normally think of it as being important is just because that typically represents most of the acreage, that a landowner
Mm-hmm.
has, unless there may be like an ag heavy area or something like that.
Yeah,
So it's like, yeah, that's going to be the bulk of your property. Let's make sure that we've got some good brooding and nesting there. Let's create more brooding and nesting. And typically, cutting trees is the number one way for a landowner to do that. On the
yeah.
average property, cutting trees is what's going to be required to do that, or cutting or killing, I guess I should
Mm-hmm.
say, because we can use herbicide to treat trees and reduce the canopy as well.
Sure.
But the
Yeah,
other
forced stand
reason,
improvement is
right? Yeah,
really effective in some scenarios.
but the other reason that just occurred to me right now for the first time, is that I think it could be super useful because of a reason that you pointed out earlier, which is that most people think about poults getting, or turkeys in general, getting too cold and not too hot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but while we're on the topic of thinking about them getting too hot, if you're on a property where the only place that brooding cover is provided is out in the opening, during summertime, like we're in right now, especially for a late hatch brood, the duration of availability of those areas to young poults is going to be very limited during the summertime because
Mm.
it's so hot, right? So if you think
Yeah,
about
that's a good point.
if you're providing some of that in the woods too, especially if you're in an area that's had forest stand improvement and there's been like a variable retention harvest implemented, which all that means is in some areas you have more trees, in some areas you have fewer. And that pattern naturally oftentimes creates itself when we go in and we start
Yeah.
selectively removing trees that aren't beneficial to turkeys because they grow in clumps. So I'll kill a
Mm-hmm.
clump of sweet gums, for example, over here and have a lot of sunlight. So I've got brooding plants, plants that are conducive to brooding cover there. And over here, I had a bunch of oaks, so I've got more shade because I retained those. So now we've
Mm-hmm.
got a situation where, okay, the sun's getting up, it's getting a little bit of hot. That hen moves into the adjacent woodland with her poults, so they have some shade. But because you've created that additional habitat within the woodlands, now they can continue to feed, which means
Yeah,
that they're still growing, they're still gaining mass, and they're still going through that. They're still putting on those feathers that they need to fly, and all that adds up to faster growth and development equals more poults that survive.
that's right. And that it was some of Lovett's work that showed that the how how long it takes birds to get to flight
Yeah,
can vary,
yeah,
and the higher availability of high quality uh, food and the less stressful on the animals, the faster you get to flight in a day or two may make a big difference in survival.
yeah. I mean, you think about it. Like, imagine if you weigh a quarter of a pound and you can barely
Quarter
walk around.
pounder.
Yeah, you're a little
I
quarter
just ordered
pounder.
one of those.
Yeah. You're a quarter pounder walking around in the woods. You can't even fly up in a tree at night, all that kind of stuff. 1, 2, 3, 4 a week. Like if we can get a poult
Hmm.
flighted in 1 week versus 2 weeks, you can imagine how profoundly that would affect
Yeah.
survival probability.
Oh yeah. They could be substantial. So there was another thing that while you were talking, it came to mind for me, and it's sort of that third step. And this is the one I feel like when I'm meeting with landowners and helping them put together a management strategy on their land, this is probably the one I spend the most time talking through and trying to get them to envision
Mhm.
what we're trying to accomplish in terms of a
Mhm.
blueprint across the property. You know why we are arranging things
Mhm.
in a particular way, and it's related to the connectivity.
Mhm.
So if you have, like what you were talking about, if you're on a 2-year return interval, well, that naturally creates a situation where you have brooding cover the year of fire next to nesting cover the year after fire, and they just kind of always switch places. And if you're doing that across a large portion of the upland, you're sort of creating a situation where the nesting and brooding are together, and that's good.
Mhm. Mhm.
But another thing that I think about quite a bit, and that it's been influenced by several people over the years that are really knowledgeable about this, uh, is thinking about connectivity throughout the property. And maybe, I run into this situation, I'm sure you do, where maybe you have a few upland pine, plantation type spots in this part of the property, and then maybe you have some hardwoods and some fields and stuff like that in between them, and then you have another patch where you can manage for a lower basal area. They're not connected across the property, in other words. So that's what I'm doing when I'm visiting with folks, is trying to figure out how can we connect areas, particularly with brooding cover,
Mhm. Mhm.
so that a hen with a brood could get from one patch to another while never leaving relatively high quality brooding cover. And that could be accomplished in a few ways. But one that am, I think is often a good way to do that is to use your road systems with daylighting.
So basically, you're just pushing the woods back away from your road.
Yeah. And, when I'm talking to landowners, there's several things that come to mind for them. A lot of people are thinking about, oh, if we need a 30-foot buffer, we'll just split it and have 15 on each side. Well, I tend to try to concentrate it on one side of the road so that it's wider.
Mhm.
And also, you kind of move your road traffic to one side of it, and it's just
Yeah.
easier from my point of view to manage it and have it accomplish what you're trying.
Yeah.
If you couple that with some other practices like edge feathering, for
Yeah.
example, you can really create a nice layout where you could have brooding and nesting cover together throughout the property, where a hen, if she chose, you got 300 acres and she's nested and hatched a brood in one corner, she could get across to the other corner without ever leaving
Mm-hmm.
a place that's safe to brood in.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that strategy is a really effective way for you to ensure that you're providing adequate nesting and brooding cover throughout the property. It's already, in most cases, the road system is designed for, well, in all cases, I guess, designed for connectivity for you so that you can get around in the property.
Yeah.
But it's also often associated with the high ground. So you kind of end up in this really nice situation where it's distributed through the property. It's often associated with the high ground that you're going to be disturbing frequently. And it also, by design, gives you access to it
Mm-hmm.
where you're going to be implementing disking or burning
Mm-hmm.
or herbicide applications or whatever is associated with your road
Right.
system already. And that,
Right.
those kinds of things are making your management more efficient and, distributing it throughout your property, which I think are, valuable traits of that management approach.
Yeah.
So I think that, just kind of going through that thought process is often really helpful for people to think through where they should target and how they should try to distribute these things throughout the property.
Yeah, and to your point, so not only if you do that, let's just say, you take your property and you go ahead and you put a 30-foot, opening along all of your roads. So you're accomplishing that objective that you just talked about of improving connectivity, but you're also
Mm-hmm.
accomplishing the objective that I talked about just a minute ago, which is increasing early successional cover.
Yes, right.
So you're doing both of those things at the same time.
Yeah, you're hitting on many points,
Yeah.
right, that are necessary to be an effective manager.
Yep.
The connectivity, the amount available, it being distributed so that many hens that may be defending good patches from each other or whatever's going on socially, they have access to it. Maybe they, for some reason, want to travel, they can do that. But it's
Mhm.
also making it more efficient for you to implement the things you need to
Yeah.
manage it.
And it's a lot of ground to play with too. Like as soon
Yeah,
as you open that up, especially if you have like I understand where you were coming from talking about doing the one roadside, but then, I've been on some properties where landowners do 30 feet on both sides of the road, you know?
yeah.
And in
If you're
that
willing to do
scenario,
that, there's nothing wrong with that.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. And so in that scenario, it's like, oh well, I'll disc one half of one side of the road this year and one half the next year, or
Hmm.
you can start patchworking down your road system, and you can burn it. You can do all. You can plant some. It's
Hmm.
fun. You can get really
Yeah,
creative with it.
there and another thing that I think comes with it is it improves the huntability of the property
Yeah,
at the same time. And
yeah,
I have seen landowners, like you said, they'll take patches and plant it. It's an awesome place to sit in the house
yeah,
during the rut.
yeah,
You can kind of sneak around the roads. Often that cover associated with them is helping you do that.
yeah.
And in many cases, it's a good place for a gobbler to strut.
And that's what I tell landowners all the time. It's like if you've got enough good nesting and brooding cover, it's like there's nothing wrong with throwing in some clover food plots here and there as like strut
Yeah,
plots, you know?
yeah. You don't have to do and don't need to do often
Yeah.
the same thing everywhere.
No.
You're trying to address what is limiting,
Right.
and if you don't have adequate nesting or brooding cover, then you need to address that.
That's right.
But uh, let's keep in mind while we're all in this and
Yeah,
obsessed with it, it's
why we want
because
to
of
make more
hunting.
turkeys in the first place is so
Yeah.
we can hunt
So
more
there's nothing
turkeys.
wrong
Yeah.
with that being part of your strategy is trying to maximize the huntability of the all the birds you're making.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't feel bad about it,
It's good stuff.
Marcus.
I don't feel bad about it at all. In
I
fact, I
mean,
see people go through an incredible amount of effort and spend an incredible amount of money because of that passion, and that I appreciate a lot.
I do too. And that's the thing, man, is like people can and do make this much more complicated than what we just laid out. And it gets complicated, especially like as property size and complexity increase, and then you've got these
Mm-hmm.
specific situations, and then you start layering on constraints like, this person also grows some crop over here and they've got some cows over, and like once you start doing all that, that's when it gets complicated. But kind of what we laid out is really the nuts and bolts of what I pay attention to when I first start going on a property managed for turkeys.
Yeah.
What is what is the current status and species composition of my openings? How many openings do I have, and do I need to create more of that? And then
Yeah.
once I have it, what does my disturbance regime look like, and what tools do I use to implement it?
Right. And I think where it gets really tricky is when you have several competing objectives. And that might be because you have, a family of landowners or a bunch of friends together, or, you know, someone else owns the land, or you need to generate revenue from it. There's all
Mhm.
kinds of reasons. There's competing objectives, but,
Yeah, it's like
the,
my
pla-
uncle
the
won't let me manage that food plot for brooding because he likes to hunt armadillos out there.
yeah, I haven't gotten that one, but yeah, so I mean, you never know what. Like that's one of the fun things about going and meeting with people is you get into all kinds of situations. Like, wow,
Yeah,
I just had no idea that people like that there was anybody that cared about that.
yeah.
So that's fun. But I think that's the the art of it, right? You're trying to take a strategy and lay that over competing objectives and try to do that in a way that still, is beneficial, producing more of the bird
Mhm.
and hunting it.
That's it.
So
Well, they got your burger ready yet?
yeah, man, I got a big old cheeseburger. So for those out there wondering why he's picking on me, I'm sitting at a chain restaurant because it was the only place I could find Wi-Fi. Because apparently up here, when it rains, everybody's Wi-Fi wires get wet, and the Wi-Fi doesn't work anywhere.
I just think this is all an elaborate ruse. You're talking about you're fly fishing for trout in northern Michigan. I think reality is you've just gone on a road trip to sample fast food burgers across the country.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's hard to detangle the two, to be honest with you.
All right.
Well, yeah, that was good stuff. Hopefully, that addressed some of the questions we've been getting. It certainly
Yeah, and I
should.
feel like it gave us a chance to tie up some loose ends related to, some recent topics and stuff like that.
Yeah, 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 for sure. So appreciate everybody, all the support. It's been great, and that we're trying to do what you're saying. With the questions and comments and everything, people want to hear about habitat, so we're trying to stay there.
Marcus, we have something to give away again today.
Oh, really?
Yes, we do. We
Well,
have from Drew Abel and the nice folks at Grounded Brand again. As promised, we have a Grounded Brand face mask and full finger gloves, of course, in Bottomland
yes.
to give away today. So, do you want to do the honors of pseudo randomly drawing someone, or should I?
I was going to let you do that
Okay.
since
I
the
figured.
glare on my screen is so bad I can't hardly read.
All right.
Man, that's pretty cool stuff. It is nice, having people in organizations, companies, getting behind this. So I can't
Absolutely.
say enough how much I appreciate all the support,
Yeah.
helping us to keep this thing going and make it successful.
All right. So, the last several giveaways that we've done, I have not had anyone reach out to me. I have not had the winner reach out to me. So, first of all,
Yeah, I have an on one as well.
yeah, so first of all, y'all got to let me know. Y'all got to listen so that you know if you win something. But second of all, we're going to have some things, recycling back into the hopper that
Yeah.
we haven't given away yet because of that. So y'all make sure, listen and reach out to us. But I want to go ahead and what I decided to do today, I wanted to go ahead and reward the folks that have been leaving us, new reviews in response to these giveaways. And so I went ahead and threw those into a hat, and I'm going to draw out of those. But for those of you that have left a review, earlier in the show history, don't worry. I'm not going to do this every week. This is just kind of a one-time thing. So the person that I drew out of the hat today is Rabbit Woods.
Rabbit Woods.
That's what he put down as his handle, is Rabbit Woods. So, Rabbit Woods, if you're listening, apparently 6 days ago you were still listening. But reach out to us and we'll get you those gloves and a face mask. Isn't that what I said?
Yep.
We'll get you those
Just
Grounded
reach out to
brand
us.
gloves and face mask.
Sweet.
Got anything else?
Good stuff, man. No, great episode. Hopefully folks appreciate it. Let us know, what you want to hear about. We are trying to do it.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.